Good afternoon. This is Minerva Delgado, and I want to welcome you to our Hunger Free Communities model addressing hunger through collective impact webinar. And I'm with the Alliance to End Hunger. I'm the Director of Coalitions and Advocacy. And joining me today is Olivia McConnell, our Hunger Free Communities Associate. This is the first of a few webinars that will talk about what the Hunger Free Communities model is, as well as, what are some of the challenges and what are some of the competencies that are needed to do this kind of work. Today's webinar will really focus on an introduction to hunger-free communities, as well as what the impact framework for hunger-free communities looks like. Right now, all of our attendees are muted, not because we don't want to hear from you, but because just want to minimize some background noise. So feel free to pose questions in the question bar. We will have a very robust discussion, we hope, once we get through the slides. So the Alliance to End Hunger, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to engage diverse institutions to build the public and political will to end hunger both at home and across the world. The Alliance to End Hunger is a membership organization. I think for those of you who may not be familiar with us, that's important to understand. We partner with national nonprofits, groups you will be familiar with, like Feeding America, Share Strength, um, faith networks like Bread for the World, who's our founding partner, Islamic Relief USA, the Council on Jewish Affairs, corporations. Our most recent corporate additions have been Amazon and Bank of America, foundations like AARP Foundation, for example, universities. And you can find a full list. We have almost 100 members. You can find a full list on our website, and I encourage you to do that. So the way we work is through collective impact, which is why this particular framework for us is so important. And that's a little bit about the Alliance. I do encourage you to take a look at our website. The Hunger Free Communities Network Initiative is our signature domestic program. So what's a hunger-free community? We use this terminology a lot. And a hunger-free community can refer to an aspirational goal. I want my community to be hunger-free. There's a past grant program from USDA that was called Hunger-Free Communities. But we refer to it as a formal or informal network, our loose definition, because we understand there's a tremendous amount of variability in these networks and coalitions. But hunger-free communities are united by their commitment to ending hunger in their communities and the inclusion of a broad range of community stakeholders. And so a coalition or an organization that's interested in forming a coalition that meets this definition can be part of the Hunger Free Communities network with the Alliance to End Hunger. And we'll talk more at the end of the webinar about how you engage with us on that. But this concept of hunger-free communities and this terminology, I want to give you a little background, and how it ties to the Alliance is that our now Executive Director Emeritus, former Congressman and Ambassador Tony Hall, when he was the chairman of the Select Committee on Hunger as a congressional representative from Ohio, they issued a resolution outlining steps for creating hunger-free communities. And so that's where the terminology comes from. So we use this terminology, hunger-free communities, but if you're involved in these efforts in your communities, you may be calling it an anti-hunger effort or an end hunger effort or a food security effort. The terminology is not so important. There's lots of different terminology that you can use. We just happen to use hunger-free communities, referring back to this resolution outlining 14 actions that community members can take, and they called for community members to come together across sectors to do things like coordinate emergency food services, engage low-income participants in policy and program development, better utilize federal nutrition programs, and increase access to nutritious foods and reduce food waste in their communities. And we have a link here to the resolution. You'll all get these slides. And so you will be able to link to that specific document if you'd like to see the original document. And I'll be talking today about collective impact. What is collective impact? So people have been working in coalition for millennia. But collective impact really refers to a very structured and strategic way of coming together that was first introduced by John Kania and Mark Kramer. I give you a link to the report, to the article that they did in the Sanford Social Innovation Review. So you can have that for reference. But collective impact really talks about bringing people together from different sectors in a structured way to bring about meaningful and sustainable progress in addressing social problems and social problems that are too big for one organization, one sector to really solve on their own. And hunger really fits this definition very well, in that it will take and does take a sustained effort across sectors to really address an issue as wide-ranging as hunger. So what they outlined was 5 conditions in this paper that lead to what they call collective impact. And I am going to go over those 5 conditions briefly, and then talk a little bit about how we conceptualize hunger-free, the impact of hunger-free communities as well. So first, they talk about a common agenda, bringing folks together collectively to define the problem and create a shared vision. One of the things I've shared in the handouts, which you can download, is a report that was done for us by Dr. Julia Carboni, who's a professor at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. She actually did interviews with some hunger-free community networks and really analyzed how they were applying collective impact as an organizing framework. And so that will have, I think, some very interesting insights into some of the challenges that people found, but also some guiding questions, so that if you're at this step of common agenda, developing a common agenda, you can see what some of those guiding questions are to help you in your process. So that's in the handouts. And it'll also give you a little insight into some of the hunger-free community groups around the country and what they've done. So common agenda is usually the first thing that you want to do, is come around the table and, one, make sure you assess your table. Who's at your table? Do you have all of the sectors and people that are needed to move an agenda forward, to define the problem? And certainly don't forget to involve people who are experiencing this problem firsthand, people with lived experience of hunger and poverty, to help define the problem and create a shared vision to solve it. So that's the first step. And these things aren't all chronological. It does sort of suggest a flow in terms of how you should approach things, but common agenda is usually where groups start. It's also where they get a little bit of a reality check that just because we all care about ending hunger doesn't mean we all define it the same way, or that we agree on what the solutions are. And so, it might make sense to have some short-term versus long-term goals. One of the particular challenges when we're talking about addressing an issue like hunger in our communities is there is, sort of a short-term need, let's say emergency food services, or people who may need WIC or SNAP, those to address their immediate needs of not having adequate food. But then you may also, as a coalition, want to start looking at what are some of those midterm or long-term solutions to really address why do people need those particular services to begin with. And so we see hunger-free community groups addressing all sorts of things, from access to healthcare, to employment and jobs, to solving the issues of a food desert. And so, coming together to really define the problem and create a shared vision, while it's not easy, it's a really important first step if you're going to do collective impact work. Shared measurement system. So this becomes really important. I think it's also an area where groups can really struggle, because having been myself the director of a food bank, we usually talk about pounds of food distributed, and that's our metric for almost everything we do in a food bank. Whereas if you're in another kind of food distribution organization, you may be looking at the number of meals served. If you're working from the perspective of food producers, farmers, you may be looking at pounds of food distributed or some other measures. And so coming together across sectors where we normally don't share measurement systems, one of the first things we have to do is really agree on how are we going, if we're agreeing to solve a particular problem and working together towards that, how are we going to track our progress? And do it in a way that it can be transparent, so we can see, hey, we're doing great over here, we need to do some work over there. And usually agreeing to a shared measurement system is an important way to hold all of the parties accountable for achieving the outcomes. Mutually reinforcing activities. So this is really about coordinating efforts in a way that maximizes the end result. So I'll give the example again of a food bank. Having been a director of a food bank, I'm in a much better position to do food distribution than I am to increase access to school breakfast, for example, in my local school, right? But hopefully in that coalition, you have included schools and you've included emergency food programs, so that you can have different activities like increasing access in school breakfast, which is very underutilized, as well as food distribution, as well as other measures, that will track towards achieving your goal. But the idea is for my organization in the coalition to do what I do well. We have a certain expertise. It doesn't make sense for us to try to work on another piece of the puzzle. My piece of the puzzle might be, improving the nutrition quality of the food that I'm distributing. Maybe that's my piece of the puzzle. But the idea is that every organization brings something to the table that contributes to the whole. And so those mutually reinforcing activities really become important, but it's also for the cohesion of the collective impact group really important for each organization to know, how am I contributing to the end result, and what their particular role is. And then the fourth condition becomes continuous communication. In any coalition, you need communication in terms of what's happening, what's the status, where are we in achieving our goals, and that takes really building trust and relationships among all the participants. I think one of the biggest surprise to people who get involved in these kinds of coalition efforts is how long it takes to build that. Right now I'm working in a national organization, and our mission is to collaborate, which works really well for me because personally that's a part of my nature. I love to collaborate. But having worked at a local organization that sometimes had to compete for funding with other anti-hunger organizations in the community. I understand how difficult that can sometimes be because when you're in a situation where you're trying to distinguish what you do from others so that you can make an appeal to funders, you know, it doesn't lend itself very neatly to collaboration. However, we can all overcome these tendencies to say, well, you know, please look at us and what we're doing everything great, you know, and we're doing it on our own to really break down some of those barriers to collaborating, which ultimately we need to do if we're going to solve this problem, you know, writ large. Because there's no one sector, no one organization that could possibly solve this community-wide problem. And so continuous communication is a way of building trust among the participants in the coalition and moving everyone forward in the sense that everyone is on the same page around what our goals are, where we are in terms of achieving those, and what we need to do to move forward. And so continuous communication becomes a very important key to the health and the effectiveness of the collaboration. And then finally, backbone support. You know, it's very important. I've seen so many coalition efforts fail because there isn't a team, and that can be one person, it can be an organization that's the backbone support, or it can be a third party. But that support, that team that's dedicated to just moving the entire thing forward, scheduling meetings, making sure that reports get out to all of the partners. And orchestrating the work of that group in terms of, you know, really kind of bringing folks together, helping them achieve agreement on things like a shared plan and what those mutually reinforcing activities are, and maintaining that communication and making sure that those communication mechanisms are in place and that they're functioning. So that backbone support, sometimes they provide funding, sometimes they don't. You know, it really depends on the setup of the coalition, but it is important to have a team dedicated to orchestrating the coalition. Otherwise, these things tend to pull apart because we are pulled in so many directions. We have so many priorities and so little time. But if everyone can commit themselves to this kind of coalition work, and having a strong backbone support can move it forward. So those are the 5 conditions for what makes for strong collective impact efforts. And next, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize success among hunger-free communities. And so we've created a hunger-free communities impact framework, and you can see, hopefully you've seen this before. If not, I know you can't read this. We're going to go over each of these steps. So don't feel like you need to memorize this or try to strain your eyes reading that. But we will, of course, be sharing this as well as part of we will share all of the slides. But this impact framework, we created this impact framework at the Alliance because it helps us understand where groups are in their journey to becoming hunger-free. And so we created this, you know, and level of impact going from lowest to highest, you can see here on a scale, but we do understand that this isn't necessarily chronological. You know, there are, and it's also not a straight line in the sense that you can be in different phases at one time, you can be cycling between phases. So I don't want you to think of this as in a rigid way, but we do believe it outlines a potential path for hunger-free community groups to become impactful in their communities. So I'll talk about each of these steps along the impact framework. So the first one is awakening. So typically this is where there is a sense in a community that there's low food security or that hunger exists in the community or hunger is on the rise. And so this then leads to some action, whether it's public sector or private sector. Typically we see, a response, to the hunger. And this typically, not every community, but we believe this characterizes most communities. What you see at first is really different hunger relief efforts. It could be groups organizing food drives. It could be groups opening pantries or soup kitchens, or groups, looking to improve school meals, but they're typically uncoordinated relief efforts. And so they're usually at this stage characterized by working in silos. Everyone's sort of doing their own thing to respond to hunger in their immediate locality. And so this is actually, before you start a hunger-free community effort, this is typically where groups are. You may see a lot of competition between groups, or groups that are, just working on their own to try to solve this issue. And then there's typically an awakening period. I'm sorry, I went backwards. Then there's typically a coalescing. For groups, there are many established hunger-free community groups around the country. We're currently working with about 75 different groups in 34 states. And those are communities where people have said, hey, we'd like to work towards having a hunger-free community or becoming, an anti-hunger coalition. And so usually you see a convening of key state community stakeholders. And we've seen this done, this coalescing, in many different ways. But there's usually at least one strategic leader who issues a call to action. So we've seen it at the mayoral level or the statewide level where, the governor has said, so just going back to the previous administration in Maryland, they said, we'd like to be hunger free. And so they actually did statewide convening around becoming hunger free. And we're going to give you some examples at the end of this specific presentation. But there's usually a strategic leader, but it doesn't have to be an elected official. Many times it's a faith leader who says, we have a moral issue, hunger is something that we need to solve for the sake of really addressing what we should be doing in our faith tradition. And it may be a faith leader that calls people together and says, hey, let's work together to solve hunger. Sometimes it's a leading anti-hunger organization. So you see hunger-free community initiatives that are led by food banks, or they may be led by a child nutrition group. Sometimes it's universities. And so you see, or sometimes it's a foundation who says, hey, let's try to get everyone together in the community to work towards this. But there's a coalescing, and it can happen in different ways, but it usually does take that strategic leader, someone people will listen to and come to the table if they call, and the identification of who should be part of that coalition. And then, if they decide to move forward, so sometimes you have a convening, and the convening, may produce some information or just information sharing. And then, that's it. And they may convene again in the future, or they may, sort of come together for a specific purpose and say, hey, we want to share information, and then just kind of go back to doing their own thing. But if they decide, usually as a collective, to move forward, they get into the formalizing phase. And so this is where you start seeing some of these things that were talked about in the collective impact framework happening, such as setting a common agenda or identifying mutually reinforcing activities or developing a shared measurement system. But the groups start cooperating and coordinating. So typically what I've seen in this stage of formalizing is food pantries from across the city that are part of this network will come together and say, hey, we need to do a better job of really coordinating when we're open. It doesn't make sense for us to all be open at the same time. Maybe it makes sense for us to be open at different times so that, community members have a range of options in terms of, where they go and get, food pantry bags. But at this point, the formalizing stage, there's something that's been created that individual organizations start to self-identify. We call it the Hunger Free Community Network, but it can be, the End Hunger Coalition or whatever else it is. But this is where we start seeing multi-sector coordination begin. So farms may be working with schools to get fresh produce into school meals. Any number of things can be happening at this stage. Typically at this stage we see an increase in farmers markets that accept SNAP, for example. That's the kind of multi-sector coordination that you can begin to see. Or businesses that start doing food rescue and working with their local food banks or food distribution sites, soup kitchens, and so forth. So you start seeing a certain level of cooperation and coordination and groups that identify as part of this network. And this may or may not lead to a separate organization. In some cases, it does. In some cases, it does, and that organization becomes a 501c3. But in many cases, I would say about a third of the groups in our network are formalized as the Hunger Free Community Group. So for example, Tampa Bay Network to End Hunger is a 501c3 with dedicated staff. And they started in this coalition mode. But many other cases, about 2/3, this doesn't lead to an independent organization, but to a coalition that's managed among a number of different groups or maybe supported by one group. And then in the maturing phase, we see more of a sustainable network that's been recognized. They have political and social capital. So usually at this stage, their advocacy becomes very strong. They're, recognized in the community. We're seeing higher levels of cross-sector food system coordination and communication. We're seeing coordination of hunger relief efforts across sectors. And typically at this stage, you start seeing the elimination of duplication and any program gaps start to be addressed. So, groups are working together in such a way that they can identify, hey, there are parts of the community that are not being served. How can we address those program gaps? And then finally, the performing stage is really an aspirational goal. There are some groups that have gotten this far, but it takes time to get to this stage where you achieve high levels of food security in the community. You have full community engagement in nutrition programs, federal nutrition programs, and there's a robust emergency food system and crisis response so that there's a strong safety net in the community for folks who might become food insecure or fall into hunger. So this stage is very much aspirational for all of the groups. And again, one of the reasons we wanted to put this impact framework together is to kind of give groups a roadmap about where you could go if you head in this direction. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia to give some key examples of groups that have engaged in this kind of collective impact work, just so that you have a better sense of how this can be done and have some examples to point to.
Thank you, Minerva. Yeah, we're going to move on to some examples we wanted to use to highlight the collective impact that Minerva has just explained to us. So our first example is going to be Hunger Free Minnesota. And they started with a campaign from 2011 to 2014 with 8 founding partners from different sectors. And it's a really good example because it was a data-driven business plan with a wide-ranging set of target initiatives. And what they did here was they wanted to close a meal gap. So Minerva mentioned earlier, one of the things that we need to make sure we have is a shared measurement system. And so what they did here was they chose to measure everything in meals. And they did this through a variety of sources. They had, agricultural food rescue, trying to gather crops that would have stayed in fields. They did SNAP awareness and education, community close-up. They did retail food rescue, so getting food from restaurants and other situations. Prepared food rescue is the same. They also did school breakfast programs and challenges, not in school time meals. They focused on hunger and health, and WIC, which is women, infants, and children. And so on this next slide, we're going to see a breakdown. And this is where they've actually measured out their goals. You can see all the way on the right, their total was they set a goal of 60 million meals. They wanted to close that gap. They had a gap of 100 million. They wanted to get to 60 million of those. And then you can see that they actually exceeded their goal by 10 million overall. And there's a breakdown of how they exceeded it in which sectors. And so there is a full report on this if you want to look into it deeper. You can see that in some places they were incredibly successful, particularly in SNAP. They exceeded their goals significantly there. And then even in places where maybe they didn't reach those goals, this is a good way to see what they were doing and how is that collective impact working and why didn't they reach their goals. All of that can be found in the report. And then if we go on to our next example.
Before we go on, Olivia, thank you for pointing out, that this is such a good example of a shared measurement, collective impact focus. So where you see here where it says campaign, that's where you can download the campaign report to really get all of the detail behind who were the organizations and how each sector did. But what I really like about this particular example is it does highlight that the reason they were able to talk about what they were accomplishing is that they did decide on a shared measure, and that measure they decided was the number of meals. So for example, measuring the number of meals is fairly simple if you're talking about school breakfast, or meals that are distributed in after-school programs. It's not as easy in SNAP, for example, right? Because in SNAP, people are purchasing food with dollars, but they were able to come up with, and also other areas like retail food rescue or agricultural food rescue. Sometimes those pounds don't necessarily convert to meals easily, but they were able to come up with a metric that they all agreed would convert to this meals number. And so I think that that's part of what makes this particular effort so successful, is that they're able to talk about what each sector was able to contribute because they used the shared measurement system. And they were able to do it in a way that allows each partner to see sort of where they're at in terms of the whole. So I think this was a great example of that shared measurement. All right, moving on.
Yeah, absolutely. The next example that we wanted to provide is from the Colorado Blueprint to End Hunger. And this was sort of envisioned in 2016 when the Colorado Health Foundation invested in efforts to consolidate research on hunger in Colorado. This is really important because I know earlier we talked about this idea of hunger relief efforts working in silos and how important it is to bring people to the table. So this was such an integral step, was just consolidating research together. And then the next step they took was the following year, 2017, they convened nearly 100 different stakeholders from a variety of sectors to closely examine challenges of hunger and to start developing solutions. And so what their solution was is a 5-year plan called the Colorado Blueprint to End Hunger. was established in 2018, and they created a plan with 5 major goals. So these goals, I'm going to go ahead and read all of the goals, but even though these are Colorado specific, I want you to just think about how these goals could really represent any community. This could definitely be, replicated in a different area. So the first goal is to increase public understanding and awareness that solving hunger is vital to the health and well-being of all individuals and families, the Colorado economy, and every local community. The second goal is going to be to increase the number of Coloradans who can access affordable, nutritious food in their communities. And as I mentioned before, this is about Coloradans, but this could be talking about any community if you were to create your own blueprint or your own 5-year plan. So goal 3 is to increase the number of Coloradans who can access food assistance and nutritious food through community-based organizations. The next goal is going to be about SNAP and WIC, to maximize SNAP and WIC enrollment to propel Colorado to become a leading state for enrollment in these health and nutrition benefit programs. And then their 5th and final goal is to maximize participation in the federal nutrition programs, making Colorado a national leader in delivering these vital programs.
Thanks, Olivia. I love this example because it's really, they really worked hard on this common agenda. They brought so many people together and put together, I think, what is a really comprehensive set of goals for the state. And we should not underestimate the amount of time and effort it took to put this together. But this roadmap, this blueprint, is one that other states can also adopt. And so this is a great example of, that common agenda and the importance of putting together that common agenda. They're now implementing this blueprint in communities, and they're doing that, in a variety of ways. But at least they have a roadmap to follow, and the importance of that, I think, can't be understated. Next.
Yeah, and so our final example that we wanted to refer to is the Texas Hunger Initiative at Baylor University. And this is a capacity building collaborative project. They brought people to the table from all over. It's a network of coalitions all across the state. And so I think it provides a really good example of how these hunger-free community networks, we have such a range in scale. Like this program has networks all across the state, but some coalitions are much smaller. Sometimes they're community level based. But this network that they have that is so broad, it addresses hunger through policy, education, community organizing, and community development. And something that we love to share with everyone is they've created a step-by-step guide for building coalitions that provides examples from the field. It has ideas for implementation and practical tools. And when you all get these slides afterwards, you can go ahead and click on that toolkit for developing and strengthening hunger-free community coalitions. And it's an incredible resource that you can use to see what they've been doing and also learn ways to replicate that in your own community.
Yes, and I really love what they've done. At the Alliance to End Hunger, we haven't created a hunger-free community kit because Texas Hunger Initiative is so strong, and so it didn't make sense. We're trying to walk the walk. We're not replicating what other people are doing well. So this is typically the toolkit we give to groups who are interested in starting their own coalitions in their own communities and states. And so highly recommended if you haven't seen it. If you're new to starting a hunger-free community, it has really great resources, step-by-step guidance and resources in this toolkit. It's pretty comprehensive, along with some great examples. And so really want to thank the work that Baylor has been doing, not just in providing support to groups in Texas, but also being, a support to groups all over the country through their work and their example. And so this is a great example of a backbone support organization and what a backbone support organization can do. And for those of you who may be in university settings, hopefully this is instructive to you in terms of thinking about how you might want to engage with your communities. And with the toolkit, as well as with all of the other things we talked about today, this is being implemented at the micro community level, sort of neighborhoods within cities, or counties or cities, and potentially across states. So don't feel like your group is too small to pick up the toolkit and work with it. If you can get multi-sector collaboration in your county, it's worthwhile starting your Hunger Free Community effort. And we do know that of the groups that we work with, most of them, 2/3 of them, are really either city-based or county-based. And they're able to accomplish a lot in their communities because they can bring together different parts of the community. So I think next, Olivia, would you share with us ways to engage for anyone who might not already be part of the Hunger Free Communities Network?
Yeah, absolutely. I recommend anyone who's not already a member of our network, please go ahead and when you get these slides, click on that link, join the Hunger Free Communities Network. We don't ask for dues or donations or anything. It's totally free to join, and you can join us with, future webinars like this. We also have lots of resources online. We have the Hunger Free Communities map, which you can see a quick preview of here on your screen. It's a great way to see where people are getting together and working. We also have the resource library, which we keep updated. We've added so many resources recently just in light of COVID, but we also have resources that are specific to, community organizing or how to improve SNAP registration. And we also have an annual summit. This year will be our first virtual annual summit. That's going to take place November 18th and 19th. And we definitely recommend all of you join us in that. I think Minerva can speak a little bit more on that if she'd like to.
Yes, as a matter of fact, thank you. We're just starting our planning, and I just want to make sure we're going to get into questions, but I want to make sure you have our contact information. But we are, if you go to our website, our 2020 Hunger Free Community Summit page is up. And at this point, we're asking for session proposals. So if you're doing some of this work in your community and you have something that you think is going really well and you want to share, please submit a session proposal. We really want to hear from you. What we're trying to do with the Hunger Free Communities Network is create this community of learning so that everyone can really understand what it takes to do this work, but also what success looks like and how they can replicate that in their communities. And so that's what the summit is about. And so we definitely encourage you to join us for the summit, or just contact us if you have any questions about any of this. Let me just do one thing. So I'd like to invite you all at this point to share any comments or questions